longevity lifestyle designers. This is Govin here, secrets of longevity.com. So you just saw there's a new intro for my channel, and it's a new logo for my business as well. I'm going to be putting that up everywhere the old symbol and logo existed, and I call it a logo, but it's a little more in depth than your typical logo, just like my last image that I'd have before my videos was even more in depth. So I've actually scaled back the complexity and the number of colors in there for that purpose, partly, but I just felt that this represented everything I wanted to show in this new incarnation of my business and the channel. So I wanted to talk to you about the symbology of it, what it means, and I'm sure some of it's fairly obvious, especially with the intro. It's got bagpipes, that's kind of Scottish sounding, although the group that made that song, which is free to use under the Creative Commons license that they have on it, so I'm very grateful for them to have that on there. They're a Russian group, and they have a little bit of the Celtic influence. They have two bagpipe players and some more Middle Eastern drums, but also some more traditional drums, and I think they're great. I've listened to a bunch of their music, so you definitely check them out. I've got a link below to their song, and I'll be having a link on every video I have this intro on, as long as I keep that song on there, just to give them due credit. So I've changed the logo and main image and the intro that I use on my channel maybe every year or two. Don't know how long this one will last, but I think it's a good little exercise I like to go through. I did create it myself, just like all of the other ones I've had on my channel, except for the first one. The first one I commissioned a friend who is an artist to do. That's the dragon around the yin-yang symbol. But this one, I was sort of inspired to do it to kind of model it after the Egyptian Ankh, because that's a powerful symbol of longevity in my mind and always has been. And I wanted to kind of carry that forward, which you can kind of see in the similar shape, although this one's constructed out of 3 runes. And my reason for using runes is I've increasingly become fascinated and drawn and just immersed in all things heathen, if you want to call it that. There's a lot of different terms for it. One could call it Odinism, or just the spiritual beliefs and practices of the Germanic tribes of Europe. As far as I know, I'm actually going to be getting my 23andMe test back any day now. I just sent it out almost a week ago, so I should be seeing it very soon in terms of understanding my ethnic background. But as far as I know, I am half or more Anglo-Saxon, just from the knowledge I have of my grandparents and parents. And then I have a fair amount of Celtic background too. My name, both Govin and Kilgore, is obviously very Celtic sounding, if you know anything about Scotland and the names of things around there. Govin is actually a borough of Edinburgh, kind of like a suburb or a region outside of it. And it is also a family last name going back in my family far enough on some matriarchal line of my paternal line, but it got turned into a middle name for my grandfather, my father, and me, and I've started using it as my first name as of a couple years ago. So yeah, increasingly I have this intense interest in tradition, family, heritage, and especially ethnic heritage and one's roots. And that probably even further back still really came about with my increased interest in health, which led to the interest and understanding that all these things around health largely have to do with what have we evolved to do, what have we evolved to eat, what have we evolved to move like. So all these things have influenced my construction of an ideal lifestyle. It's influenced a lot of what I talk about on this channel, as you know. And I figured one of the last things that has really been affected by this idea is, because I just never had a concept of and full understanding of what it was, is that spiritually, and I'm not an atheist, but I think a lot of what I have to talk about here is of value to atheists or agnostics as well. But the Christianization of European peoples really wiped out a fair amount of our history. But a lot of fragments, and even very large fragments to the point of there's a very clear understanding of these things, exist that described the ideas and beliefs and worldviews of our ancient ancestors. So aside from the monotheistic religions, almost every tradition on the planet was pagan and was based in ethnicity, more or less. That doesn't mean that you're against other people that are outside of your ethnic group. No, it simply means that you acknowledge that you have this connection to your ancestors and they've passed something down to you, and it's your purpose to make sure that that gets passed down and continue on forward. And this is something that you hear in a variety of traditions. One example is like in Native American traditions, you often hear about the idea that you want to think 7 generations ahead with every decision so that you don't negatively impact them. And if you look at the world today, a lot of negative things that are happening are largely due to people wanting to get quick advantages without thinking long-term about how this is going to affect theirs, as well as their communities, as well as the greater world's future circumstances in terms of how they're going to be able to live with abundance and sustainability. So to clarify what the Germanic or heathen tribes were, on a map, their locations that they became into was largely Northern Europe as well as Western Europe. They came over and became part of the British Isles. They intermixed obviously with the Celts. The Celts and the Germanic tribes were almost indistinguishable except by language and writing, or what writings and markings they had. And the reason I'm sort of resonating more with the Germanic side isn't to like kind of slough off whatever Celtic roots I have. It's partly because there's a lot more preservation of the traditions and their original writing, which was the runes. Now, it wasn't so prevalent that everyone knew how to write and everyone used it, but it was a combination of writing as well as esoteric work, much in the same way that Hebrew has that ancient roots, which has the sort of magical esoteric side of it with the Kabbalah, and then, say, Sanskrit has that esoteric side to it with yoga and the recitation of mantras and things like that. Well, the same thing occurs with runes. So for me, I have done a whole assortment of different spiritual practices since a long time ago, even before I was really into sort of the more grounded aspects of health, like diet, nutrition, and exercise. I was meditating and doing yoga from probably the age of 14, 15, 16, and it really picked up from there, and I was very devoted for a while to that. Then it turned to Chinese martial arts, then it went back to yoga, got into Chinese Taoist herbalism too, and I have nothing against those things. If people resonate with that, they should certainly pursue it. But for me, the runes right now have become a very prominent area of study for me, as well as the mythologies within the Germanic traditions. So Norse, Germany, Norman, which is the area of Normandy, which was settled by Vikings, and then they went and took over parts of England, or the UK at one point. The Anglo-Saxons, which were originally Danish, and certain other areas of Europe. These are the areas where the Germanic tribes settled most prominently. They were still largely hunter-gatherer. They did eventually get into farming, but they were literally the last groups within Europe to fully settle down. When the Vikings were pillaging the United Kingdom, as well as coming down and sweeping through southern Europe by the Mediterranean, they were doing so because they were still partially hunter-gatherers. And they knew that there was a lot of abundance that had been built up through the more agricultural areas of Europe, and they would have these stores of wealth that they could take advantage of. And then they also wanted to settle those areas to become farmers themselves. And if you've ever seen this show, Vikings, it's quite interesting to see the reenactment of some of those times. Although there's some historical inaccuracies, overall it's a very good show. I'd highly recommend it for anyone that's interested in learning more about a time period. Now, there isn't complete recordings and preservation of every aspect of the mythology and the traditions from each of those areas. What we see a lot of is each area having different things that they preserved, and then some areas they have overlap, and you can actually see an extreme amount of similarity. So, for example, you look at the qualities of the Norse gods, Odin, Thor, even Tyr, and you look at the Anglo-Saxon gods of Woden, Thunor, and Tiw. They are nearly identical in appearance and description in their mythologies, etc. They just have slightly changed names over time. So you can understand that these things have the common root. So there's a lot more of the mythology preserved within Norse paganism around the gods and their traditions in that regard, but in Anglo-Saxon regions in the UK, there was a lot more preservation of the runes in terms of their descriptions behind them. So because this area of their lore and tradition was preserved, that has been applied to some of the lacking parts of the Norse traditions, and then that can also be applied to other areas of Europe that had these Germanic areas. Even if we go beyond just the Germanic traditions, you get into Celtic, there's even the Slavic, there's a lot of similarities between the deities. They have slightly further still divergent qualities, like the equivalent of Thor in Celtic tradition is Tyrannus, slightly similar name, and he was a warrior god who, instead of having a hammer, he threw lightning bolts, but the Celtic name for thunder or lightning, I forget which it is, sounds a lot like the name for Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. And he had a long beard. He was often depicted carrying a 8-spoked wheel, or between 6 and 8 spokes, which was the wheel used on chariots at the time, and Thor rides a chariot pulled by 2 goats. The Slavic god Perun, he had a red beard. He drove around in a chariot pulled by 1 goat, and he threw a hammer or an axe that would return to him, depending on which area you look at. He had different things sometimes. But you see the extreme similarities just in my brief description there. And that goes across several different deities within these different pantheons. So that really shows a common sort of Proto-European root. And as you get to other world religions and things, you can even see some similarities, but they're even more divergent. Like you compare the more Hellenistic pantheons, which is still European, but they're slightly more removed, and then you compare, say, the Egyptian pantheon. They're a step removed further still, but you know, it's quite an interesting thing. That's something I've always had a fascinating time learning about and reading up on. But yeah, just lately I've been focused on that, so I've created this logo and this symbol to represent the qualities that I've promoted through this channel, as well as I want to see continue on being promoted. And I think the energy of the runes themselves kind of carry forward and can be inspiring in and of themselves, even to those who might not share that same root or same tradition. But yeah, if you want to learn more about ethnic religions, I definitely recommend checking out the links below. So we have the link to that Russian group Dudeldrum, where you can hear that song and some of their other music. We have the link to just the Wikipedia page on ethnic religion, just so you can see just the vast numbers of different religions like this. And then we also have a link, I'll just throw in there also, if you want to learn more about runes, there's a great podcast on YouTube. The podcasts are posted to YouTube by Daniel Updike, called Northern Runes Radio. I'm far from being an expert in runes, so don't ask me any questions. I'm just going to give a brief description of these 3 runes and why I think they're significant and wanted to include them in this logo. So in the intro there you saw that transition with the highlighted red runes. That makes up the 3 that are together there. And the first one, which I had positioned horizontally just to kind of make the crossbar similar to the cross I had on the Ankh, it actually goes the other way as depicted or as written, and it is that shape. But it was actually the first rune that came to me when I was learning about it that I wanted to include in this new logo. And part of its core representation is longevity, immortality, renewal, but also the process of death and renewal, not necessarily physical death. Aiwaz, or Aiwaz as it's called, is also the old word for yew, meaning the yew bush or the yew tree. So the representation of yew is that it's very flexible, it stays green year round, so that's kind of like this continual life that it represents. It's also got that slight toxic effect, which kind of represents the death, like the seeds within the fruit of the yew bush or yew tree are quite toxic if you chew them. I've eaten plenty of yew berries before without swallowing or chewing the seeds. They're very hard. They're not like a raspberry seed or other seed in a berry that are easy to chew up. They're like a little pit, like a peach stone or a cherry stone, but slightly smaller. But you definitely do not want to consume them. If you accidentally swallowed one, you're probably fine because it's going to go through you. But if you happen to break one, it does not take many, 2, 3, 4, and you could be looking at ending up in hospital. So I definitely recommend caution around them especially with children and pets. But I'll probably do a video in the future actually on foraging them, because it is actually a very sweet, delicious berry. And of course the evergreen quality of the branches actually emit a bit of a toxin in the air, which might just make you feel dizzy. I remember playing hide and seek as a kid. We've always had them in front of every house I grew up in, wherever I happened to live, and I'd often hide in them, and it was just a very nice, relaxing place to hide. And I don't recall being dizzy, but I would find it kind of like subduing being under there. Now I know why. So among the original runes, known as the Elder Futhark, it appears right around the middle at rune number 13. And then with the other two runes I've chose, they're actually at either opposite ends. So I've kind of also incorporated the entire rune alphabet in some ways by doing one from either end and one from the middle. Funny thing is, I didn't intend to do that. I just realized that once I was finished. So you could always check out Daniel Updike's videos and podcasts if you want to learn more. And the thing that I find absolutely incredible is that the Heathens, or the Germanic tribes, had a chakra system. They called them Hvels. I don't know too much about them, but they're sort of like the understanding they had of the energy system of the body, and this rune really encompassed that. It encompassed sort of the spinal energy of the central column, that if you're familiar with sort of energy body terms, that's what that would relate to. So the next rune I incorporated into that was Othala, which is sort of that ribbon shape, if you think of a ribbon being folded over. And that enclosed area is really representative of family and tight-knit community, and that's what the rune represents. It basically means homeland or ancestral inheritance. And for me, and also I've heard other people talk about this, it also nowadays really represents your genetic inheritance. It's what you receive from your ancestors, and a large part of that, not just about physical home or assets or things, is your body, your features, your potential genetic health and integrity. So incorporating that is obviously huge for my channel. It's something I refer to and talk about. So I think this is an important energy to represent just people in general today, because it's something that we have less awareness of. A lot of people don't like the term property, but in my view, and I've talked about this quite a bit on my channel, property rights and the feeling and acknowledgement of being solidly centered in the place that you live is powerful, and it's protective. I think the erosion of property rights has led to less of a feeling of community, because people don't, in the backs of their minds, fully feel like they're present in the land that they live, and thus government and other powers that be can slowly, gradually encroach into our lives and attempt to manage and control us, which is definitely counter to the ideas of health and prosperity that I'm all for. Another factor within this, like I mentioned around the idea of ethnic religions, is that when you start to almost, I don't want to use the term worship, but when you have it be a part of your thoughts, this idea of ancestry and what it is that you come from, your stock, your background, the more you sort of have reverence for that, the more you want to pass that on and create that for future generations, whether you have children or not. I think it goes to say that when you have that reverence for the past, you can sort of pay it forward, so to speak. And that's really what I find this rune represents, and I wanted to bring into the logo. The next rune, which is the one at the bottom, it's actually upside down just to fit it in with creating sort of something, an emblem that looked quite similar to the Ankh, the Egyptian Ankh, is Fehu. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, Othala is, depending on the interpretation, either the last rune or the second last rune of the original 24 Elder Futhark. Now, Fehu is actually the first rune. And by the way, the term Futhark comes from just reading those first 5 runes as a word. And that's why some of the later rune groupings were called other things, because they actually had slightly changed or slightly rearranged orders of the runes. Like the Anglo-Saxon one is called Futhorc, as opposed to Futhark. And so that first one is the Fehu rune, which is actually the first in every tradition. And it kind of looks like an F. And the absolute most literal translation is cattle. So if we look at the Norse, but also the other Germanic areas, animal husbandry occurred far before agriculture began. So they started having cattle and things, and that was the case with virtually every hunter-gatherer group, is they started to round up animals and tame them and get them to be productions of food, which allowed them to settle and be more stationary. So this idea of mobile property and new beginnings and wealth is a lot more than just the physical terms. Just like all the rooms, there's sort of like the physical meaning of it, but it's also metaphorical for our spiritual and mental quality. So unlike Othala, which might represent in some regards your home and the land you live on, mobile wealth is more of the idea of what can be moved around very easily, liquid assets basically, but also refers to luck, success in general, personal power, and even food, because the cattle were largely the main sustenance of the people of that time. So obviously food is right in line with this channel, but also these ideas of prosperity and abundance are essential for longevity and health. I've covered that a lot on the channel, and these ideas, I think, all tie together between these three runes. And if you're wondering why I've gone to this length and created this thing to tie these runes together, there's actually a practice which has this esoteric side to it called rune binding, which is when you combine different runes together that is meant to contain all the qualities and purposes with all the runes that are there into one powerful image. In particular, the Fega rune, the first reason actually I put it in there was in the rune binding practice, it is often used as a potentiator. It's got this quality because it represents mobile prosperity and success and luck. It represents sort of like a driving force to get the qualities of that rune combination out into the world. So it speeds it up and makes it stronger. So with that, I'm curious what you think of this whole new intro as well as the outro, which you're going to see in a few seconds here. But also these ideas around your heritage and that being significant around not just your health and your day-to-day living, which we know these things can benefit the knowledge around that, but also your spiritual or sort of concepts of your tribe. I'm not advocating people not interact with people that are outside of their group, but I think in modern culture there's a lot of sort of dismissal of that, especially for some of us who get the finger pointed at as being parts of groups that are blamed for a lot of the world's problems. But really, we have to just acknowledge that our heritage matters, and so the heritage of a larger group that we belong to matters, and can help us in learning about it, understand ourselves in a deeper way. So that's what I want to put out there increasingly with my channel, is to encourage people to look into things like that. So check out those links below, and with that I'll talk to you again soon. Take care and embrace life without limits.